Where I go to school, there's a highway, and then there's the school on one side of the road, and then there's a graveyard across the street on the other side. Today for acting class, my teacher decided to take my class out to the graveyard. And I was a little bit wary of this because I'm not a fan of graveyards, but I just went with it because I knew it would be a very interesting learning experience. In my acting class, we're working on Shakespearean monologues, and the monologue that I chose was Puck's monologue from A Midsummer Night's Dream from Act 5, Scene 1. And it's one of Puck's lesser-known monologues, and I really like it because of the language and because it's not really a famous one. My teacher said to go out and walk in the graveyard, to touch and feel the environment around us, like to touch the graves and touch the trees and sit in the grass, and speak our monologues and just practice them while we're walking through a graveyard. In my monologue, there's a couple lines about a graveyard and graves. It is, "Now it is the time of night, that the graves all gaping wide, every one lets forth its sprite, in the churchway paths to glide." So I thought this should be an interesting experience because some of my monologue talks about graves. When I started to walk through the graveyard, I kind of kept on the blacktop road that was mainly running through the graveyard, and then it branched off into different sides. At first, when I was walking through, I just looked really quickly at the graves and the headstones that were on the right side of the road, and I didn't really pay attention to them. But then I started to notice names that I recognized, names of teachers at my school from their family members who might have been buried there, or family friends that I knew. And then I started to really pay attention to what was on the graves and to read them. And it was really interesting to see how there were some graves for family members that were all in a row, and then there were some for kids who had died at 6 years old, or there was one for 2 weeks old. And then there was one grave that was hand carved, the dedication of it, I think that's what it's called. And it was really interesting because the family was probably illiterate and probably didn't have enough money to pay to get the headstone carved. At a certain point of walking through the graveyard, I remembered that I had to start saying my monologue, so I decided to sit down in the grass in the middle of the graveyard, in the middle of a row of graves, and just say my monologue. So I sat down, cross-legged, Indian style, put my hands in the grass, closed my eyes, and just started speaking my monologue. And I had this really strange experience. I kind of felt energies coming out of the ground and in the air from the graveyard. Actually, when I was saying the lines about the graves, I sat there with my eyes closed and just recited it, and I could feel energy pulsing through my body. Every time that I said my monologue when I was in the graveyard, I made sure to sit down on the grass, put my hands down, close my eyes, and just feel the energies floating in the graveyard. And there was a lot of different feelings of energies that I felt when I was sitting there. At one point I was sitting in a row of graves for army soldiers who had died, and then the second time I sat down to say my monologue, I was sitting in the row of graves for the children who had died. And it felt really different because I felt a young kind of energy coming from the graves for the children, and then an older, more mature kind of feeling and energy coming from the graves for the soldiers. It was kind of an out-of-body experience because I felt like I was embodying something. Have you ever had any kind of experience like that? Let me know in the comments.